historical development we are approaching to the current, to your age. By now, I think you have at least a clear idea how political and economic, political orientation and economic philosophy of a certain regime tends to affect the content of labor relation. Under the time of the emperor, the assumption was capitalist path of development, market economy. In a market economy type of economic philosophy, the labor law tries to regulate both parties with little protection to labor. It tries to give room to both employers and employees, but a margin of protection to the weaker party. When it comes to the socialist path of development, the communist ideology, an element of communist ideology, and command economy, you tend to see that the content of the labor law tends to be excessively pro-labor. Of course, the private sector was very much marginalized, even in the political and economic field. But the fact that we have excessively pro-labor labor law doesn't mean that there will be a measurable gain to the employees unless the economy is vibrant. The right remains in labor anyway. That was what we had at the time of the Derg. Because of the command economy, because of also the war economy, we had a civil war, so out the time of the Derg, the economy was loss-making. Because of that, even though a lot of entitlements were put in place in paper, there was no measurable gain to labor. The labor was still destitute. There was no salary increment almost the whole time of the Derg. There was no bonus because they were gaining profit. So the private sector was very suffocated. Unless there is a private sector, there will not be much employment that could be generated. Therefore, a lot of unemployment was there. So you have those things. Therefore, what it means is, unless you try to strike a reasonable balance between these two interests, it will be simply a futile exercise. That is, I think, the point to note. With this, as a background, with the downfall of the military regime, we have the post-military labor relation. The traditional period from 1991 to sometime 1995 or so, even in the post-transition, the federal traditional period, we have it. Prior to looking at the content of the labor proclamation again, there is an infamous background as to the economic philosophy and the political organization of that period. As soon as the APRDF forces assumed political power, It was 1991. From 1980s, sometime the third quarter of the 20th century, from 1970s, especially from 1980s. If you try to see the general international situation, earlier we had two blocks, the Western Bloc versus Eastern Bloc. The Western Bloc to mean the capitalist society, mainly by the United States, covering North America, Western Europe, etc. So, capitalist ideology. The Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, as the countries that guides that bloc, including Eastern Europe, the satellites of the Soviet Union. So, communist orientation, communist bloc. So we have this divide. Now, sometime at the beginning of the 1980s, the Eastern Bloc began to disintegrate, especially with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that the wall that divides Eastern Berlin and Western Berlin, the Eastern being socialist, the Western being capitalist. With the disintegration of the wall and the unification of Germany, a lot of things happened. So disintegration of communism, disintegration of the Eastern Bloc means disintegration of communism. With the disintegration of communism, the Western world, neoliberalism, as a philosophy, leave everything to the market. Earlier there was liberalism, it was interrupted by certain events here and there. Now, let's go back to liberal attitude. Let's leave the economic affairs to the private sector. So the older philosophy was reintroduced. Therefore, with this, mainly the World Bank and the IMF, as messengers of the neoliberalism ideology, were trying to convince their members to enter into what they call liberalization, privatization, market deregulation, let's liberalize the economy. Let's give room for competition. Let the state roll back from the economy. Privatization. State-owned enterprises need to be privatized. That is what rolling back from the economy means. Earlier, the state was the owner because of those philosophies in many countries, including in ours, you remember, during communitary regime. That was what we had. But now, the state should roll back from the economy as fast as possible, as vast as possible. Market deregulation, let's leave quality, quantity, price to the market. Let the market, let supply and demand determine everything, including labor market deregulation. Earlier, there was a contention as to whether labor is a commodity or not. But it was already answered in 1944. Philadelphia Declaration, that labor is not a commodity. Decommodification of labor. That was the time. But now, with neoliberalism, they tend to challenge that position. Let market deregulation means let also labor be exposed to market. Its price should be determined based on market basis, to the extent of let's not have minimum wage. That is what it means. Let them bargain, let the supply and demand determine. The earlier understanding was when something that should be left to the market is commodity. Labor is not a commodity because behind the labor there is a human being that can be motivated and demotivated. There is no commodity that can be motivated and demotivated. Therefore, because of this unique future of labor, even though labor is an important input of production, it should not be left to the market. That was the understanding of the Philadelphia Declaration. The earlier understanding was labor, like any input of production, need to be regulated by supply and demand. But now, in 1980s, this position began to be challenged. Structural adjustment of enterprises. Many of the state-owned enterprises were overstaffed because under state enterprise and under state price understanding, they are not there not only to make profit, but also to generate employment. Because of that objective, many of them were overstaffed. Now, with the structural adjustment, with the neoliberal philosophy, they began to prescribe to their members to undertake structural adjustment, layoff, reduction of labor force, etc. was prescribed. Especially in those areas where communism was the prevailing philosophy, the state ownership was the rule rather than the exception. Now, the World Bank and the IMF began to send delegations to these countries to advise them to enter into this kind of economic measure, economic scheme. These countries, because of the new shock their economy was very much adversely affected. They need to revive their economy. They needed loan, technical assistance, whatever. Therefore, the loans, technical assistance are to be obtained from these organizations. These are basically the World Bank and the IMF. These are lending institutions, donor institutions. Therefore, in order to obtain loan, grant, or technical assistance, they attach conditions that need to be met by the donor recipient countries. So, these situations. But it's not only in the Eastern Bloc of Europe or elsewhere, but also in developing countries. Developing countries in Africa, developing countries in Asia, developing countries in Latin America. They were very much dependent on the handouts of these institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. And the World Bank and the IMF prescribed conditions that need to be taken in order to receive loan, grant, or technical assistance. And these are the prescriptions. So, for every country, it is, you need to liberalize your economy, you need to privatize your state-owned enterprises, you need to regulate, to deregulate the market, including the labor market. Otherwise, you cannot obtain loan, you cannot obtain technical assistance, you cannot obtain grant from these institutions. So some writers call this one-size-fits-all policy. For every country, they consider that this solution works everywhere. Liberalization, privatization, not only privatization as soon as possible and as fast as possible in terms of timing, in terms of coverage. You need to go out from the economy as soon as possible for every country, irrespective of their level of development, irrespective of what other considerations. This was what has been prescribed. So many countries had no option but to accept the prescription. So beginning from 1980s, including the 1990s, it was a period of privatization, it was a period of liberalization, etc. Market deregulation. Now, it is at this relevant point in time that the EPRDF assumed power, 1991. So, the economy was, the Ethiopian economy at this time was not performing well because of recurrent drought, obviously. At least every 10 years we have been affected by drought. Because of the civil war, beginning from the north, its coverage was extended to the hinterland. And because of the policy that marginalizes the private sector, as a combination of these all problems, I think the then government of the EPRDF said that they received an empty treasury at the National Bank. Leave alone foreign exchange, the birr aspect was also almost empty. So they had to rely the handouts of the donor organizations, the World Bank and the IMF. Of course, bilateral arrangement is also. These are multilateral institutions. The bilateral also, individual countries, the developed countries, they all are capitalists, so they are aligned to that principle. Even the funds that have been accumulated by these institutions is the funds that have been pulled from the developed capitalist countries. So it is the same prescription. Even the bilateral aspect is having the same prescription. You will get grant, technical assistance, or loan if you comply with this prescription. If not, you will not get. And the firm is very much decisive to regain competitiveness. So the Ethiopian government had to make choice. Earlier, the EPRDF people were very much left-oriented. While they were at the jungle, they were claiming that they are going to introduce Albanian style of communism in Ethiopia. But now, when they were marching to Addis, Albania has already collapsed. Not only Albania, but the Soviet Union, including the total Eastern Bloc, has disintegrated. So that was visible. A change of circumstance has been created. There is no longer Eastern Bloc that can support their ideology, their political orientation. They badly need assistance. Of course, they tend to say that we were internally motivated to privatize because we understand that the public sector was not performing well. But anyway, be it by internal motivation or by external pressure to obtain grant or loan, as soon as they are having their power, they say they are going to follow market economy, market-oriented economy. So the economic policy. We are going to leave everything to market. With this private sector development, we are going to give favorable legal framework, policy framework for the private sector to develop. You remember, under the military regime, the private sector was considered exploitative, class enemy. Now there is a paradigm shift. Private sector development, on the basis of this, private sector is engine of development. It is the engine of economic development. So this is a huge paradigm shift from a status of class enemy that need to be destroyed if possible. Now that the engine of the economy, the essential for economic development. They also declare that the state should limit its involvement in the economy. They don't prescribe for total withdrawal of the state from the economy. They will only, the state will remain in the economy to control what economists call commanding heights of the economy. What are these? What are the commanding heights of the economy? What do you think? Commanding heights of the economy. Command post. The crucial, the decisive establishments of the economy, like infrastructures, communication. Yes. Yes. Commanding heads of the economy. These are sectors of the economy that are crucial to the whole development. Infrastructure. It could be telecommunication, power generation and distribution, steel production, railway, whatever. The Ethiopian terminology is key establishments. The Transitional Parade economic policy says the state will limit itself to owning key establishments. The non-key are to be left to the private sector. The key establishments many of them were these elements. So with this, the state decided that it will introduce privatization scheme. Privatization scheme to mean the formerly state-owned enterprise will be given to the private sector on sale, on lease, or whatever arrangement. There are a lot of modalities of privatization anyway, but the point is the state is to roll back from the economy to its traditional functions, lawmaking, legislating, law adjudication, except of course with the key establishment. The reason why the state decided to remain controlling the key establishments is that these are establishments that require huge amount of capital and that would generate profit at a prolonged time. Therefore, the private sector may not have the capacity to invest in this because they may involve huge capital. Or even if the private sector is capable in terms of capital to invest in this, because of the prolonged period of profit generation, they may not have an interest to invest in this. Because, as you already know, profit maximization is the major concern of the private sector. So to obtain profit as much as possible and as soon as possible. Therefore, these key establishments are not attractive sectors, but they are key in the sense that unless you invest in this, the whole economy will stuck. Therefore, the way out is the state should intervene. Especially in Ethiopian situation, earlier the private sector was very much marginalized. Therefore, there was no meaningful private sector to engage in this unless you invite foreigners, and the invitation of foreigners will take a lot of time because they would like to see the political security, the social security, the economic feasibility. A lot of considerations will be considered. Therefore, until some time, there will be gap. So in order to fill the gap, the government should, in the economy, the government should control these establishments and run them because it may be in a better position to obtain grant or loan from the so-called lending institutions. So it is with this economic situation that the 1993 Labor Proclamation was promulgated. 1991, 92, so 93. It was at a period of privatization. It was a period where the government has changed its economic policy. Therefore, with this, a new labor code that tends to give favorable condition for the private sector was necessary. Unless you do that, the private sector will not be encouraged to invest. So what happened? What do we have in terms of the content? Earlier, as I said in paper, the Labor Proclamation under the military regime, under the Derg regime, was with a lot of entitlements. We had employment security because termination was very much costly. If you terminate without satisfying what has been spelled out as the grounds of termination, the employee will be reinstated with back pay. So it's very much costly. There were a lot of social welfare provisions, the annual leave, the maternity leave, the sick leave, whatever, you have them already. Now, if you automatically dispossess this all from labor, the labor will protest. Therefore, on the one hand, there is a challenge. On the one hand, you would like to give favorable condition to the private sector. Favorable condition to the private sector in terms of labor means making cost of labor cheaper. Making cost of hiring and firing cheaper. Making social welfare cheaper, meaning short maternity leave, short annual leave, short sick leave. Because they are paid leaves, you are, in fact, the private sector is going to pay for a service that was not rendered. Because in annual, when an employee is in annual leave, she is not rendering service to the employer. So this makes cost of labor expensive. Therefore, there is a need to make that reduction on the one hand. On the other hand, these rights have already been acquired by the employees from the prior regime. So if you begin to dispossess any or many of this, it will backfire. Labor will be dissatisfied, labor unrest may be created, so that labor unrest may lead to social unrest, political unrest, whatever. Especially when you are in a situation of democratic way of administration. If you try to dispossess labor rights that have been already acquired, you will be punished by a ballot box. Therefore, the issue is very much fragile. You need to accommodate these all concerns. Therefore, the government had to make choice. In what areas should it concede to the benefit of the employer? In what area should it retain what has been already gained under the previous law? So this requires certain cost-benefit analysis. So it is from this perspective that we need to see the contents of that new labor law of 1993, labor law that was issued in an economic environment of this time. In terms of social welfare, many of them were being retained. Even some of them are extended actually. For example, annual leave. What was the calculation of annual leave under the military regime? What did we say? How was it formulated? Yes, the minimum being 14 working days for 1 year of service. Annual leave is to be entitled for 1 year of service actually. For 1 year of service, 14 working days. For 14 working days in the form of consecutive days, it could be longer, that means, because the non-working days are to be counted in favor of the employee. That is what it means. We have already read this last class. So 14 plus 1. Under this proclamation also, that was retained. Annually retained. Status quo maintained. Sick leave, what was the entitlement under the military law? 6 months. 6 months. 6 months in totality, in aggregate, but as far as the payment is concerned, it's not all the 6 months that is paid, it's rather segregated in brackets. Here again, retained. Status quo maintained. Maternity leave. How was it formulated?
45 days of paid leave.
Yeah, postnatal, 45 days with full pay. Under this proclamation, I think it was extended to 3 months. And the division is pre and postnatal. The prenatal being 1 month, the postnatal being 2 months, and with full pay. So in this area, the government decided to maintain the status quo, or even to go beyond that, especially in reproductive sphere. They came up with an additional entitlement in terms of length of the leave. The other area is employment security. How was it formulated? Yes. Legislatively determined grounds determined grounds of termination. So the grounds has been exhaustively spelled out by the legislator. Outside of those grounds, no termination, no lawful termination. If you happen to terminate an employee outside of the lawful terminations, the remedy was what?
Reinstatement.
Reinstatement with full back pay. You will be reinstated to your previous employment position with back pay, with total payment of wage for the time the employee didn't render service. This was the formulation. So the cost of hiring was very much expensive. Rigid labor market. Labor markets are categorized into flexible labor market and rigid labor market. If labor market is flexible, that means hiring and firing will be easier to undertake. But in this kind of formulation, it's called rigid labor market, in the sense that you cannot fire at your pleasure. There will be serious consequence. So now with this, what does this proclamation come up? the new proclamation a little bit relaxed the labor market. Of course, even under this new proclamation, legislatively, grounds of termination are legislatively determined. But longer list of grounds have been incorporated. Longer and broader actually. You need to compare them for purpose of further understanding. Therefore, under the military regime, the labor proclamation of the military regime, this is 68 of 75. This is 42 of 93. In both cases, there is no termination without legal ground. That principle is still maintained. But the difference is the listing under the previous proclamation is very narrow compared to the listing that has been spelled out under the new proclamation. You need to compare those things. I think this is Article 40 of Proclamation 68 of 75, but under 42 of 95, you have a lot of grounds. 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. These all are grounds of termination under the new proclamation, under the proclamation 42. So, long list, different kinds of termination to be held lawfully. That is one difference. So, it gives a margin of flexibility to the wider margin of flexibility to the employer to terminate. That means termination means avoidance of unwanted service. So the employer, compared to, when you compare the two legal instruments, the employer under 4293 had, of course, that is the past, had wider margin of flexibility to fire unwanted service. That is one. The second thing, even if the termination is unlawful, the remedy is not solely reinstatement. The remedy is either reinstatement or compensation. So different solution. You remember under the Civil Code, what was the remedy for unlawful termination? Yeah. Under the Civil Code, the remedy was compensation. There was no right to be reinstated. The employer was not obligated to accept unwanted service. That is what it means. Under the military regime, the remedy was reinstatement. Even at the objection of the employer, the employee will be reinstated. The employer will be compelled to accept unwanted service. That was what it means. Now, these are two extremes. Proclamation 42 of 93 tries to come up with a middle ground. Reinstatement or compensation. Who is going to determine whether the employee is to be reinstated or compensated and separated? The labor tribunal, the court. Labor tribunal, it could be a court, a regular, depending on where the jurisdiction lies. It could be a court or a labor relations board. We will see when we discuss jurisdictions. The court will have an opportunity to see the parties before it. Therefore, in order to make a decision on case by case, the proclamation empowers the labor tribunal to decide. Therefore, what it means is, instead of legislatively determined remedy, the remedy is to be determined judicially. The judge will have wider margin of flexibility to decide in favor of reinstatement or in favor of compensation and separation. Affirming the termination, it may compensate. Except there is a limitation on that actually. Except what the legislator calls prohibited grounds. Except where the termination is on prohibited grounds, the court is empowered to award either reinstatement or compensation. In cases of prohibited grounds, again the legislator comes into the picture and regulates the situation. If the termination was on what the law considers as prohibited grounds, the remedy is reinstatement. So again, legislative determination. So it is a little bit complicated. Reinstatement, if on prohibited grounds. If the termination was effected on prohibited grounds. What are these prohibited grounds? Can you guess? A good guess. Technically, under labor literature, we have what we call retaliatory dismissal. What about this? You are nearer to the solution. What do you think is retaliatory dismissal? Any guess? Thank you. So, retaliatory dismissal. Dismissal in retaliation of something. Therefore, maybe the employer may dismiss the employee because of the employee's trade union membership. Or because trade union leadership. Or because the employee has brought a suit against the employer. Or the employee has assumed as a witness in a suit that was undertaken by another employee and the employer. And the employee was testifying against the employer. So if it took measure on the basis of those things, or if the employer terminates the employee because of his or her religion, ethnicity, political orientation, political outlook, because of sex discrimination, these all things are prohibited grounds. Taking retaliatory dismissal is prohibited. Discriminating because of one exercises his or her right to join trade union is a fundamental right of an employee. Why should an employee be a victim because of this? To assume trade union leadership equally is a right that has been given by law or by the Constitution. Why should an employee be a victim of dismissal because of this? To bring an action, court action against the employer, whether you will succeed in that or not is something that will be judicially determined. But the employer is not entitled to take measure because of that situation. To appear as a witness, sometimes it's even an obligation to testify what you observed. So why should an employee be a victim of dismissal because of this? Ethnic origin, religion, sex. Some of them are unchosen anyway, unchangeable. You cannot choose your ethnicity. You will find yourself in that state. Why should you be a victim of that? Sex. Of course, in the current world, there are tendencies that people may choose their sex, but naturally, you cannot choose your sex. You will find yourself in that state of affairs. So why should you be a victim, a target? The political outlook, freedom of expression is there, freedom of belief is there, a lot of things are there. So because of those things, the law has identified some grounds that will be taken seriously. They are called, literature calls them prohibited grounds. So termination on those grounds is not only unlawful, but the remedy is legislatively determined. Even the court cannot change the decision. If the employee doesn't want to be reinstated, of course, that will be forced labor. If you compel him to be reinstated, if the judge compels him to be reinstated, it will be tantamount to forced labor and conditional. Otherwise, Even if the employer is unwilling to receive this employee, the employer will be compelled anyways. Except those prohibited grounds, you will find them under Article 26, sub 2 maybe, of that proclamation. They are also reproduced, of course, in the current proclamation also. 377 and the current proclamation, you have similar arrangement, we shall see them. But since we are dealing with that proclamation, we have this. Then, in order for the court, outside of those prohibited grounds, as I said, it will be within the discretion of the judge either to award reinstatement or compensation. But it's not a blank check discretion given to the court. In order to avoid subjectivity, the law has put a sort of parameter for the court to comply. Maybe let's use the terminology of the law in order to be perfect and legal, of course. If the worker demands reinstatement, this is under 377. The continuation of the particular worker-employer relation by its nature is likely to give rise to serious difficulties. If the court is of the opinion that if the tribunal, we not only be the court, if the tribunal is of the opinion that the particular employee relations by its nature is likely to give rise to serious difficulties. So, by looking at the facts on the ground, by looking at what has been testified and what has been found in the litigation, if the court is of the opinion that if the employee is reinstated, there will not be fruitful, productive employer-employee relationship. Thereafter, he will decide in favor of compensation rather than reinstatement. If the holding of the court is otherwise, well, there is minor disagreements in the courtroom, but anyway, this is something that can be expected from litigation. But if they are left to employer-employee relationship, there may not be any problem. It will order towards reinstatement rather than compensation. So, maintenance of industrial peace. would there be fruitful employer-employee relationship? Would there be productive employer-employee relationship if the parties are to be obligated to continue their relationship? Is what the court tries to answer in that. If the answer for that is yes, reinstatement. If the answer for that is no, compensation. So the court has been given with general terms of reference in place. The assumption is courts will exercise this discretion responsibly. But in many cases there are problems. Anyway, we shall see actual cases. This is then what is given to them. Very subjective in fact. Some courts are very much pro-labor, even if they view that these people may not continue, there will be difficult relationship between them, they still opt for reinstatement, assuming that in a country like Ethiopia where a lot of unemployed labor force is on the market, denying this employer security is a very harsh measure. Therefore, let's reinstate this employee. Others try to see it in a very relaxed way. If they sense that there is no more productive relationship between the two, they will opt for compensation. Now, okay, if they reinstate, are they going to reinstate the employee with full pay? Or is that only reinstatement? Why? If they opt for compensation, is the compensation that is going to be determined by the court? Or do we have liquidated amount? Is another option. Under Proclamation 68 of 1975, if the employee is to be reinstated, the employee is to be reinstated with full pay. Even if the litigation went to the extent of 1 year and a half, at the time of reinstatement, the employee will be paid this whole 1 year and a half unpaid wage. That is what reinstatement with full pay means. Under the current proclamation, even if the tribunal opts for reinstatement with a maximum of 6 months wage. It's not with full pay. The litigation might have taken 1 year or 2 years. Even if the court considers that the termination was unlawful and therefore the employee should be reinstated, it cannot award him the full amount. Because the understanding is wage is to be paid for service that is to be rendered in normal circumstances. Therefore, it will be unfair to the employer to require it to pay wage for unrendered service. Therefore, 6 months wage. So one of the areas where the legislator began to be sympathetic to the employer is here. One, it didn't award reinstatement every time. Two, even if reinstatement is to be awarded, it's not with full pay. So, this is one thing. The second thing is, what if the court didn't consider reinstatement as a remedy, and therefore decides to approve the termination, even though the termination is unlawful, it would like to approve because it will have adverse effect on their future relationship, therefore they need to be separated. Otherwise, industrial peace could be destabilized, working-place relationship could be destabilized. That is what industrial peace means. In that case, the compensation is liquidated. It's not open for the court to determine. It's liquidated amount, 6 months' wage. $100 times of the daily wage. So that means in effect 6 months wage. Compensation for unlawful termination. So the assumption is it will have deterrence effect. The employers, if they know that an employee may challenge their measure before a court of law or before a level tribunal and may obtain reinstatement or a payment to the extent of 6 months' wage, they will think twice prior to terminating. They will try to check whether they have valid ground of termination or not. So that is what we have. This is how this proclamation tries to regulate the employment security aspect, yes. I don't think that we are not seriously difficulties, especially from the employer side, in majority of the case, it's not the employer that will appear before court anyway. It will be this representative lawyer that will appear. It is only the record. And litigation is not to be considered serious difficulty. It's normal difficulty anyway. People, one way or the other, will litigate. At the end of the day, it will be the court that will decide who will be the winner and the loser. The fact that they litigated before a court wouldn't consider as serious difficulty. I think there is a court, a Supreme Court decision to that effect. This is under volume 14 of the Cassation Bench decision, file number 82336. አንድ ሰራተኛ መብቱን ለማስከበር በአሰሪው ላይ በፍርድ ቤት ክስ በመስረቱ ብቻ ከአሰሪው ጋር ለወደፊቱ የሻከረ ግንኙነት ይፈጥራል የማያስብልና የስራውን እንዳይቀጥል ለማድረግ የሚያስችል ምክንያት አይደለም ነው የሚለው ኤግዛምፕል ዩር ኬዝ ማለት ነው። So courts do not consider, because the other option is very much disadvantageous to the employee. Therefore, courts would like to interpret it narrowly, because it will have an effect of dispossessing the employee of his or her employment security that is very much important right in the current Ethiopian situation. Had labor mobility been at ease, meaning you lose employment here and you will have an opportunity to be employed elsewhere, courts might have adopted a sort of relaxed interpretation on this, because it will be unfair to impose unwanted labor on the employer, but on the other side, when you try to see it on the other side. But usually they adopt a very restrictive interpretation.
No, so 6 months.
Yeah, 6 months is wage. Of course, there are other entitlements. Actually, we are going to see them on effect of termination. In addition to this amount, there is what we call severance payment, except that the amount is the same. Okay. The other introduction of this proclamation is on freedom of association. On the collective labor aspect, if you remember, at the time of the military regime, we said it is only the employees that can associate. Employers were very much marginalized. Even small enterprise owners, they were there coexisting somehow. But even those people were not allowed to form associations because of the then existing philosophy. Now that freedom of association is available to both, therefore back to compliance with Ethiopia's international obligation to convention, ILO Convention 87 requires member states to come up with favorable legal framework that will enable employers and employees to form associations of their own choice. That was the prescription of the convention. The law was going against that because of its political orientation and, of course, economic policy, marginalizing the employers. Now, this government, considering that it is adopting free market economy and encouraging private sector to the extent possible, it reintroduced the freedom of association of the employers into the legal formulation. With respect to the minimum membership to form, of course, for employers, the minimum membership is anyway 2, because employers in majority of the case are association of capital in many cases, therefore 2 will be sufficient. But for the purpose of employees, minimum membership under the regime was, how much was that? Yeah, 20 employees men retained under this proclamation. Under proclamation 42 of 97, the minimum threshold to form a trade union was retained at 20. The other thing in trade union formation or in association formation, we have what we call unitary union policy versus plural union policy. What do you think is this? Unitary union policy, plurality of unions policy. Any guess? Sometimes guess works out, especially in choice. Yes, Hilda? That is the point. Unitary union policy, or sometimes literature policy, monopoly of unions. Monopoly of union policy. What it means is, in an undertaking, for example, what it means is you have a minimum threshold of 20. If we think of an enterprise that has 1,000 labor force, under the unitary union policy, for example, if 100 of them decides to form a union, you will, for whatever reason, you have 900 employees outside of the union. These 900 union members of the labor force will have a choice. They will either join the already established union, or they will not exercise their rights of association. They cannot, with the existence of a pre-existing trade union, they cannot establish another union. That is one or none policy. And the reason that may be forwarded for this is, what do you think is the reason? Is there any wisdom in this? Having a single union in an enterprise? What is the reason? Labor solidarity. If you have the assumption is, whether it's correct or not, we are going to discuss it in its appropriate context, but now the assumption is the reason why countries try to prescribe a single union is to strengthen the bargaining power of the labor in that particular enterprise. If you allow plural unions, you are going to erode the solidarity of the labor market, the solidarity of the labor force. Therefore, their bargaining position will be equally fragmented, and they cannot obtain better concession from the employer. So in order to attain that, countries would like to adopt a unitary union policy. You will have only a single union in an enterprise, or no union at all. The plural exactly is different. Technically, in an enterprise where you have 1,000 employees, if the minimum threshold is 20, you can have how much unions would you have technically? 1,000 divided to 20. No, zero. Hamsa. Well, legally you can have to the extent of 50 unions in that enterprise. You know how fragmented the labor force will be, how divided the labor force will be. But anyway, when you try to see it from the angle of freedom of association, the opportunity either to join the already established union or to form another union of their own choosing. From that perspective, it is advantageous. But from the solidarity of the labor force aspect, it is a disadvantageous. Therefore, countries try to adopt one way or the other. From this perspective, both Proclamation 68 of 75 and Proclamation 42 of 93 adopted unitary union policy. We shall see what 377 adopted at a later stage, or even we can mention it. Therefore, in this case, both of them are similar, in a similar mindset. But the ILO is against this kind of prescription. Freedom of association means leaving the choice to the employees how to organize. Therefore, countries cannot prescribe this kind of policy. Of course, they can prescribe minimum membership. So long as the threshold is not higher, that would tantamount to denying the right to organize. Countries are at liberty to determine the minimum membership to establish a union. To this extent, ILO is happy. But prescribing only one union in an enterprise is undue interference on the right to organize. It should be left to the employees themselves to determine, because that paternalistic approach of states will have undemocratic effect. Therefore, for the ILO, plural unions should be possible. Laws of member states should make plurality of unions possible. Of course, ILO is not also in favor of plural unions, because, as we said earlier, it has a concern that labor will be fragmented. Sometimes even the controversy would be between the different trade unions among themselves, rather than organizing themselves in one basket and confront the employer to obtain better concession. They may create confrontation among each other. But it should be for them to determine. It's not for the member states to prescribe. So because of that, the ILO was criticizing Proclamation 68 of 75 because of at least two things. One, because it doesn't grant the employers the right to associate. Secondly, it prescribes unitary union policy. Now, with the coming into effect of Proclamation 42 of 93, the first criticism was avoided because it gave room for the employers to associate. But still, since it adopted unitary union policy, still ILO was unhappy with that proclamation. So the criticism, even though reduced in terms of magnitude, was there. Therefore, in order to rectify that defect, Proclamation 377 of 2003 has come up with plurality of unions principle. Democratic. Even though, of course, trade unions were unhappy with the introduction of this proclamation. They said this is a deliberate exercise of the government to weaken labor organizations. But the argument was that it is a prescription of the ILO. We need to comply with the ILO recommendations. So in reality, actually, the fact that plurality of unions is allowed doesn't mean that a lot of associations will be created. Because the labor is knowledgeable of themselves. If they are left alone, they will arrive at a rational decision. Because they are aware that fragmented organization will erode their strength. So now we are on plurality of unions policy. As a plural society, we have it. Of course, in the current proclamation also, that has been maintained, and we are going to discuss it. Since it is an operational issue, another point that was introduced in this proclamation is it came up with a provision on protection against anti-union discrimination. In industrial relation, in the majority of the cases, employers are unhappy when a union is established within their premises, because they are well aware that if a union is established, they will organize, they will demand for benefit. So, power and profit. They will militate against power and profit. Once the union is established, they will require the employer to come up with a recruitment policy. How is recruitment to be effected? What points are going to be taken into account in advance, so that there will be a transparent recruitment process. They may even claim that they need to have membership in the recruitment committee, and they would like to have presence in promotion committee. They would like to have presence in disciplinary committee, so that they will see for themselves how their members, how well or how fair their members are being treated in the many processes, either in recruitment. Recruitment, of course, is pre-employment stage, but the current proclamation tries even to cover that. So, at the level of recruitment, at the level of promotion, at the level of disciplinary measure, a lot of unfair treatment may occur. So once a union is established, it may claim its presence in these areas, in these committees. That means power of the employer will be eroded because it will be a sort of co-decision or it will be a sort of co-consultation. Earlier, the employer was at liberty to recruit. The employer was at liberty to promote, etc. So, power will be diminishing, employer prerogative will be diminished. Then the profit aspect, obviously, when a union is established, in many cases, they will come up with a proposal for salary increment. They will come up with a proposal for a bonus. If the company attains a profit of this threshold, we need to be given bonus of 2 months' wage, 3 months' wage, whatever. Salary increment 10% of our salary every year because of inflation, because of something. So again, militating against profit. Earlier, the employer was taking the lion's share. But with the establishment of a union, they will demand for equitable profit sharing, either in the form of salary increment, in the form of bonus, or whatever. So because of that, employers are hostile toward this union formation, toward these union members, toward these union officials. Because of this hostility, they may take different measures against union members, union organizers, or union officials. But again, from the employees' angle, formation of a union is a constitutional right, a right emanating from the ILO Convention, a right emanating from the Labour Proclamation. So why should these people be targets? Because of the exercise of lawful activity. In order to rectify that problem, the law has come up with anti-union discrimination. One of the provisions of anti-union discrimination is the provision that I indicated earlier. If someone is terminated because of his union membership, her union leadership, they will be reinstated. If the measure that has been taken is short of termination, if the employer denied promotion because of the fact that the employee was a union member or a union official, it can still challenge this before a court of law and get remedy for this, etc. Therefore, provisions on anti-union discrimination have been included for the first time in this proclamation. Actually, in Proclamation 68 of 75, that was not a problem. Because of the political orientation of the military regime, union leaders were very much favorably treated. Sometimes even there was a sort of fusion between party membership and trade union leadership. There was a single party at that time, Workers' Party of Ethiopia, the ISAPA. Higher trade union leadership were to the extent of central committee members of that party. Therefore, there was a fusion. If unknown unfavorable treatment, there was a sort of quote-unquote privilege to those people. Therefore, at that time, it was not very much a problem. But now, with the introduction of private sector development, private employers may have hostile attitude against trade union members or trade union leaders. Therefore, they deserve protection. In order to address that aspect, Proclamation 42 of 93 has come up with different provisions to this effect. This is the kind of introduction. Finally, because since we need to wind up this discussion at this stage, labor relations board, I think it's obvious now that employers are also having the right to association. Labor relations board was reintroduced. You remember it was under the emperor, and members were drawn from the employers association and the labor association, the trade union association, because of the denial of the right to employers by this proclamation. Labor relations board was not there. Now it was reintroduced by this proclamation, Proclamation 42 of 1993. The other thing is this proclamation is a sort of codification compared to Proclamation 42 of 75 and compared to 210 of 1963. These were dealing with specific area of labor relation. Proclamation 210 of 1963, it was mainly interested on collective labor relations. Proclamation 68 of 75, it was it tried to address both individual labor relation and collective labor relation. But there were some relevant issues that need to be contained in a labor code. Safe and healthy working condition, workmen's compensation, this was not included under that proclamation. What happens if an employee is injured in a workplace? Under Proclamation 68 of 75, there was no remedy, therefore there was a need to go to the civil code. You remember under the civil code I mentioned that protective measure and remedial measure. There was also what we call labor inspection service. How do we inspect whether employers are in compliance with the minimum threshold, the labor standard? There needs to be regular inspection or incidental inspection in workplaces. Proclamation 68 of 75 doesn't have any provision on labor inspection. But this proclamation 42 of 1973, it regulates safety and health, it regulates workmen's compensation, it regulates labor inspection, it regulates strike, it regulates unionization, freedom of association, it regulates individual labor relation, it regulates minimum labor condition. Therefore, technically speaking, it is a code rather than a piece of legislation, because it tries to comprehensively regulate possible issues that are relevant to labor relations. Therefore now, since the coming into effect of Proclamation 42 of 1993, we are having labor code rather than labor legislation. That goes on to 377 of 2003, then to 1156 of 2019. So, quote, comprehensive regulation of possible issues to the extent possible. That doesn't mean that there may not be a possibility to go to other branch of law, but it is as a last resort, and it is very minimal, so to say. Okay, I think በምሳ ሰዓት ከዚህ በላይ መያዝ ወንጀል ሳይሆን አይቀርም። Okay, God dismiss.